It begins with a promise of sweetness without consequence. For decades, artificial sweeteners have been marketed as the guilt-free answer to sugar. From brightly colored packets on diner tables to diet sodas filling supermarket shelves, they've been sold as a miracle, all the flavor, none of the calories, and a ticket to better health. For many, these sweeteners became a lifeline, a way to enjoy sweetness without the looming shadow of diabetes, weight gain, and tooth decay. But behind that comforting promise lies a darker truth, one rarely discussed outside the halls of medical conferences and the pages of specialized journals. The story of artificial sweeteners is not one of pure innovation, but of corporate influence, selective science, and long-term health effects that remain disturbingly unclear. To understand how we got here, we have to go back not to the modern diet craze of the 1980s or the low-carb wave of the 2000s, but to a laboratory accident in 1879. A young chemist at Johns Hopkins University named Konstantin Fallberg was working on coal tar derivatives when he noticed a strange sweetness on his hands. That accidental discovery would become saccharin, the world's first artificial sweetener. By the early 20th century, saccharin was hailed as a marvel of chemistry, embraced during wartime sugar shortages, and celebrated as a calorie-free luxury. But even in those early days, there were doubts. In 1907, the US government investigated saccharin after concerns about its safety. President Theodore Roosevelt famously dismissed the fears, saying, "Anyone who says saccharin is injurious is an idiot." And so saccharin's place on American tables was cemented not through definitive science, but through political will. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, and the food industry had a new obsession: diet products. The 1960s brought cyclamate, another artificial sweetener, often blended with saccharin for a more sugar-like taste. For a time, it seemed unstoppable until a 1969 study linked cyclamate to bladder cancer in lab rats. Almost overnight, the US banned it, even as other countries continued to allow its use. The public had been given its first taste of the unsettling truth: these sweeteners were not as harmless as the marketing claimed. Yet the demand for low-calorie sweetness only grew. In the 1980s, aspartame entered the scene under the brand names Equal and NutraSweet, its approval championed by one of the most contentious regulatory battles in FDA history. Aspartame's path to market was marred by conflicting studies, allegations of manipulated data, and deep ties between industry lobbyists and political power. Critics claimed the FDA bent its own safety rules to push approval through. Proponents called it a safe and rigorously tested alternative to sugar. In the decades that followed, the artificial sweetener market exploded: sucralose splendor, acesulfame potassium, neotame advantame, and a flood of stevia-based blends that blurred the line between natural and artificial. They became part of our morning coffee, our protein shakes, our gum, our toothpaste, our baked goods, and even our so-called health snacks. If you weren't consciously avoiding them, chances are you were consuming them daily. But here's the problem. The science surrounding artificial sweeteners has never been settled. For every study claiming safety, there's another raising red flags: links to metabolic changes, gut microbiome disruption, increased cravings, and even higher risks of obesity and diabetes in the long run. Some research suggests they may alter how our bodies process glucose, paradoxically increasing the risk of the very diseases they were meant to prevent. The story gets even more complicated when you follow the money. Many of the reassuring safety studies have been funded directly or indirectly by the companies that profit from these sweeteners. Independent research often tells a different story, one the food industry works hard to discredit. Regulatory bodies around the world, from the European Food Safety Authority to the US FDA, rely heavily on industry-submitted data for safety assessments, leaving glaring gaps in independent long-term research. Consumers, meanwhile, are caught in the middle. The fear of sugar's health risks diabetes, obesity, heart disease, drives people toward artificial alternatives. Marketing exploits that fear, presenting these additives as a safe, modern solution. But what if that solution is simply a trade-off? What if we've replaced one health risk with another, more insidious one that takes decades to fully reveal itself? This documentary isn't here to tell you to panic, nor to assure you everything's fine. It's here to peel back the layers to examine the history, the science, the industry influence, and the emerging evidence that challenges the narrative we've been sold. Because sweetness without consequence may be the biggest illusion in modern food science, and once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. By the late 1970s, artificial sweeteners weren't just chemical additives, they were political assets. The US was in the throes of a health-conscious movement, and the demand for low-calorie products was soaring. But with every promise of a safe sugar substitute came mounting skepticism. And in Washington, skepticism often collides with profit in ways the public never sees. The story of aspartame's approval is a case study in how science, politics, and corporate power can converge to shape what ends up in our food supply. Aspartame was discovered in 1965 by a chemist at G.D. Searle and Company, another lab accident that would change the global food industry. For years, Searle pushed for FDA approval, but early studies revealed troubling signs, brain tumors in lab animals, neurological symptoms, and unexplained deaths. The FDA's own scientists expressed concern, calling for more rigorous long-term testing before the product could be considered safe. Then came the turning point, not in the lab, but in the political arena. In 1981, just months after Ronald Reagan took office, a new FDA commissioner was appointed, Dr. Arthur Hull Hayes. Hayes was relatively unknown in the food safety world, but he quickly became a pivotal figure. In one of his first major decisions, he overruled the FDA's own public board of inquiry, which had recommended against approving aspartame based on the available evidence. His ruling allowed aspartame to enter the US market, a decision many critics argue was influenced more by corporate lobbying than scientific certainty. It wasn't the last time politics would override caution. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, a revolving door between the food industry and regulatory agencies became increasingly apparent. Former FDA officials went on to work for companies that manufactured sweeteners, while industry-funded studies found their way into government safety reviews. Corporate lobbying was, and still is, a formidable force. The Calorie Control Council, a powerful industry group representing manufacturers of artificial sweeteners, spent millions shaping public perception and influencing policy. They funded advertising campaigns promoting sweeteners as tools for weight control and diabetes prevention. They also sponsored scientific conferences, paid for educational materials for schools, and worked behind the scenes to counter any negative publicity. Meanwhile, independent researchers who raised concerns often found themselves marginalized. In some cases, funding for their projects was cut. In others, their work was discredited by industry-friendly scientists in high-profile journals. This wasn't a simple matter of scientific disagreement. It was a systematic effort to control the narrative. Internationally, the same dynamics played out. In Europe, regulatory approval of certain sweeteners sparked fierce debate, with some countries imposing bans or restrictions, while others embraced the products wholeheartedly. The European Food Safety Authority, like the FDA, often relied on studies provided by manufacturers, a practice that left room for bias and conflict of interest. Perhaps most telling are the legal battles. Over the decades, lawsuits have alleged that companies misled the public about the safety of their products, failed to disclose known risks, or manipulated research outcomes. Some cases were quietly settled out of court with details sealed from public view. Others dragged on for years, only to be dismissed for lack of conclusive evidence, a standard that can be difficult to meet when the science is complex, and the long-term effects may take decades to manifest. The industry's messaging was carefully crafted. Artificial sweeteners were framed as modern, scientific, and essential for public health in an age of rising obesity and diabetes. Opponents were painted as alarmists, clinging to outdated fears. And for a time, the strategy worked. Sales of diet sodas and sugar-free products surged, but the cracks in the narrative began to show. Emerging research in the early 2000s suggested that artificial sweeteners might not actually help with weight loss in the long run. In some studies, people who regularly consumed diet products gained more weight than those who didn't. Theories emerged that sweeteners could disrupt the body's natural ability to regulate calorie intake, or that they might alter gut bacteria in ways that promote fat storage and insulin resistance. These findings were inconvenient, to say the least, And once again, industry groups moved quickly to discredit the research commissioning counter-studies and flooding the media with reassuring headlines. But for the first time, the public's trust began to waver. The battle over artificial sweeteners was no longer just about science, it was about credibility. And in the world of public health, once credibility starts to erode, it's hard to win it back. As the story unfolds, we'll see how these credibility battles gave rise to a new front in the sweetener wars. One fought not just in boardrooms and laboratories, but in the human body itself. Because the most compelling evidence against artificial sweeteners wasn't in government reports or courtroom documents. It was in the way they quietly altered our biology, one sip and one bite at a time. From the moment a granule of artificial sweetener touches your tongue, a complex chain reaction begins, one that feels deceptively like sugar, but tells a very different story to your body. Sweetness, biologically speaking, isn't just about pleasure, it's an ancient survival cue. For most of human history, sweet flavors signaled energy-rich foods, ripe fruit, honey mother's milk, all essential to survival. Our brains evolved to reward sweetness with a rush of dopamine, reinforcing the behavior so we'd seek it out again. But artificial sweeteners hijack this evolutionary pathway in ways our bodies never evolved to handle. Unlike natural sugar, most artificial sweeteners, saccharin, aspartame, sucralose, acesulfame, potassium, deliver that burst of sweetness without the expected calories. The brain detects the sweet taste and sends hormonal signals, preparing the body to process a surge of energy. Insulin release may spike, digestive enzymes adjust, and metabolic pathways shift, all in anticipation of fuel that never arrives. This mismatch, scientists argue, can lead to metabolic confusion. Over time, the body may become less efficient at regulating blood sugar, increasing the risk of insulin resistance, a precursor to type 2 diabetes. Some studies suggest that frequent sweetener consumption may prime the brain to crave more sweetness, overall making it harder to resist sugary foods later. But the story doesn't end in the brain or bloodstream. In recent years, the gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria that live in our intestines, has emerged as a critical player in how our bodies respond to artificial sweeteners. Research from the Weizmann Institute in Israel found that certain sweeteners can significantly alter the composition of gut bacteria, fostering strains linked to glucose intolerance. In controlled experiments, mice fed artificial sweeteners developed higher blood sugar levels than those fed regular sugar. When researchers transplanted gut bacteria from these mice into germ-free mice, the new hosts developed the same glucose intolerance, a clear sign that the microbiome changes were driving the effect. For humans, the data is more nuanced, but no less concerning. Trials have shown that sucralose and saccharin in particular can disrupt gut flora within just days of consumption. The result? Inflammation-impaired metabolism and possible downstream effects on immune function and even mental health. Neurologically, artificial sweeteners pose another riddle. Aspartame, for example, breaks down in the body into phenylalanine, aspartic acid, and methanol. While these compounds are naturally found in foods, concentrated doses, especially in individuals with certain genetic sensitivities, can have unintended effects. Phenylalanine can cross the blood-brain barrier and interfere with neurotransmitter production, potentially affecting mood and cognitive performance. Some consumers have reported headaches, dizziness, or brain fog after consuming diet product, symptoms that in rare cases disappear when sweeteners are eliminated from the diet. While these accounts are anecdotal, they've fueled ongoing debates in the medical community. One of the most compelling and troubling theories is that artificial sweeteners could be perpetuating the very problems they were meant to solve. If they train the palate to expect intense sweetness, less sweet whole foods become less appealing. This creates a feedback loop. The more artificial sweetness we consume, the more we seek it out, and the harder it becomes to enjoy naturally sweet or savory flavors. Meanwhile, corporations market these products as tools for weight control, especially targeting people with diabetes or those trying to cut calories. Yet multiple long-term observational studies have found that regular consumers of diet sodas often have higher BMIs and greater waist circumference than non-consumers. The exact mechanism remains under investigation, but the correlation is hard to ignore. Perhaps the most unsettling part: Many of these effects are subtle and cumulative, building over years. You won't drink one can of diet soda and wake up with metabolic syndrome the next day. But over a decade, the risk adds up. And because the health outcomes, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, are multifactorial, it's easy for the industry to deflect blame. The science is still evolving, but one thing is certain. The calorie-free promise of artificial sweeteners doesn't mean they're consequence-free. And the gap between perception and reality has been widened not just by science, but by decades of calculated messaging. By the time artificial sweeteners had made their way into everything from soda cans to salad dressings, the public had been told a simple, seductive story. These are modern miracles of science, safe, calorie-free, and essential for a healthier future. But this wasn't just the result of a few clever ads. It was the product of a decades-long multi-layered public relations strategy designed to win over consumers, regulators, and the scientific community all at once. The campaign began with language. The word artificial carried baggage, so marketing experts shifted toward terms like low-calorie sweetener or sugar substitute, phrases that implied innovation without invoking images of lab beakers and chemical formulas. Corporate-funded nutritionists appeared in morning talk shows, newspaper health columns, and even classroom materials describing sweeteners as tools for weight management rather than processed chemicals. Then came the advertising blitz. In the 1980s and 90s, Diet Coke and Diet Pepsi were marketed as lifestyle choices, sleek, modern, and aspirational. Commercials featured models and celebrities drinking diet sodas on yachts, in offices, at the gym. The underlying message was clear: these weren't just beverages. They were badges of discipline and sophistication. But perhaps the most powerful tactic wasn't on TV at all, it was in the pages of scientific journals. The sweetener industry learned early on that peer-reviewed research carries an authority that advertising never could. So corporations began funding studies, hundreds of them. Often these studies were carefully designed to produce favorable results, short-term trials with healthy adult volunteers, doses calibrated to avoid triggering measurable harm endpoints that focused on immediate effects rather than long-term risks. When less flattering results emerged, as they inevitably did, industry-funded scientists were ready to challenge them. They would question the methodology, highlight any statistical weaknesses, and call for more research before any conclusions could be drawn. This tactic didn't just buy time. It cast doubt on the credibility of independent scientists, muddying the waters for regulators and the public alike. Public health organizations were another crucial front. Groups like the American Diabetes Association and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics received funding from sweetener manufacturers, and in return, often issued public statements reinforcing the safety and benefits of these products. The partnerships weren't always explicit endorsements, but the optics worked in the industry's favor. If respected health bodies weren't warning against these chemicals, why should the average consumer worry? The lobbying arm of the industry was equally strategic. Corporate representatives cultivated relationships with lawmakers, offering campaign donations, expert testimony, and educational briefings about the economic importance of low-calorie sweeteners. When regulatory agencies considered stricter labeling or safety reviews, lobbyists argued that such measures would harm consumer choice and unfairly stigmatize products that had already passed existing safety standards. And then there was the direct-to-consumer playbook, one that relied on psychology as much as science. The marketing tapped into guilt, aspiration, and fear all at once. Ads would show a woman enjoying dessert with a caption like, "Go ahead, you deserve it." The subtext, "You can indulge without consequence because science has your back." These tactics didn't just protect profits, they shaped public consciousness. By the mid-2000s, artificial sweeteners had become so normalized that questioning them felt almost conspiratorial. If everyone from the dietitian on your morning show to the soda in your fridge said they were fine, then maybe the skeptics really were just alarmists. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Social media was emerging as a disruptor to traditional PR, giving whistleblowers, independent journalists, and grassroots health advocates a platform to share research and personal testimonies that didn't fit the corporate narrative. In 2013, a viral blog post from a former food industry insider described how internal documents revealed targeted campaigns to market sweeteners to children, despite internal concerns about long-term exposure. Around the same time, investigative reporters began unearthing studies that had been buried or left unpublished because they showed potential harm. The result was a slow erosion of the trust the industry had spent decades building. For the first time, public conversations about sweeteners weren't just about dieting, they were about transparency ethics and the hidden influence of corporate money on public health policy. For decades, the artificial sweetener industry has leaned on abstract arguments, metabolic health, caloric balance, dietary freedom to promote its products. But beneath the scientific jargon and glossy advertising lies a more visceral truth. Real people with real health consequences, often discovered too late. Consider the case of Patricia, a 42-year-old mother from Ohio. She had switched to diet sodas in her 20s, convinced by her doctor and the relentless commercials that it was a smart choice for managing her weight. For years, she drank 3 or 4 cans a day, priding herself on avoiding the empty calories of regular soda. But by her late 30s, she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Her doctor was puzzled. She had cut back on sugar years ago. It wasn't until Patricia stumbled across a research article linking artificial sweeteners to insulin resistance that she began to connect the dots. "I felt betrayed," she later said. "I was doing what I thought was right, and it backfired." Or take Daniel, a semi-professional cyclist from the UK. He relied heavily on zero-calorie energy drinks sweetened with sucralose and aspartame potassium. At first, they seemed like the perfect training tool: hydration, caffeine, and no sugar crash. But over time, Daniel began experiencing chronic bloating stomach pain and bouts of anxiety he couldn't explain. After a gut microbiome test revealed significant bacterial imbalance, his nutritionist suggested cutting out artificial sweeteners entirely. Within weeks, the gastrointestinal issues improved, but the damage to his performance and mental well-being lingered for months. These stories aren't isolated. Across online forums, health groups, and patient advocacy networks, countless people share eerily similar accounts: migraines that vanish after dropping diet sodas, mysterious weight gain despite calorie restriction, mood swings tied to artificially sweetened products. While not all of these cases can be directly proven as cause and effect, the patterns are difficult to ignore. Part of the danger lies in cumulative exposure. Artificial sweeteners don't just hide in obvious places like sodas or sugar-free gum. They're in flavored yogurts, protein powders, ketchup, cough drops, even health bars marketed to children. For someone who snacks throughout the day, the intake can be constant, and with each brand using different compounds, the cocktail of chemicals becomes more complex. And while the short-term effects may be subtle, the long-term stakes are high. Multiple large-scale observational studies have linked frequent consumption of artificial sweeteners to increased risks of obesity, heart disease, and stroke. In 2022, a French study involving over 100,000 participants found that higher intakes of aspartame and acetylsulfame potassium were associated with a significantly elevated risk of cardiovascular disease. Perhaps the most unsettling cases involve pregnant women and children, two populations that should, in theory, be most protected. Research suggests that prenatal exposure to artificial sweeteners can influence the gut microbiome and metabolic health of infants, potentially predisposing them to obesity later in life. Yet marketing campaigns for products like sugar-free flavored waters and diet snacks often feature imagery of happy families, subtly signaling that these products are safe for everyone. Corporate responses to these concerns have been predictable: dismiss anecdotal evidence as isolated incidents, downplay observational studies as inconclusive, and point to regulatory approvals as proof of safety. But those approvals, as critics argue, often rely on outdated science or short-term testing that fails to capture chronic low-dose exposure over decades. This disconnect between marketing promises and lived reality mirrors other public health crises, from tobacco to trans fats, where industries insisted on safety long after warning signs appeared. And like those cases, the truth rarely comes to light without whistleblowers, investigative journalism, or sustained public pressure. The most haunting element is that for many, the damage is invisible until it's too late. Metabolic shifts, microbiome changes, and neurological effects can build quietly, masked by other lifestyle factors. By the time a diagnosis is made, there's rarely a clear trail back to the culprit. For years, the artificial sweetener industry operated with near-total impunity. The narrative was simple: 0 calories, no guilt, modern science at its best. But in recent years, that narrative has begun to crumble, not because the corporations suddenly admitted fault, but because ordinary people, independent scientists, and even some governments refused to stay silent. It started quietly. A handful of independent researchers, often without corporate funding, began publishing studies that challenged decades of established science. They questioned not just whether artificial sweeteners were safe in the short term, but what they might be doing to human metabolism, gut health, and long-term disease risk. Unlike industry-backed trials, these studies sometimes followed participants for years, revealing subtle but consistent trends. Altered insulin responses, shifts in microbiome composition, increased appetite. These findings began circulating beyond academic journals. Health bloggers, nutrition, YouTubers, and medical whistleblowers took the research to the public, stripping away the jargon and translating it into something anyone could understand. These sweeteners may not be the miracle they've been sold as. One viral video showing the chemical manufacturing process of aspartame drew millions of views, triggering widespread disgust. Grassroots activism picked up speed. In Europe, consumer groups petitioned for stricter labeling laws, demanding that products containing certain artificial sweeteners carry warnings about potential health risks. In 2022, France and several Scandinavian countries publicly debated restricting aspartame in children's products, a move that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. Mexico, which had already implemented sugar taxes, began considering similar measures for artificially sweetened beverages, citing the need for more comprehensive public health protections. Lawsuits also started to appear. While most failed to make it past the early stages, thanks to the industry's formidable legal teams, they still brought attention to the issue. One notable case in the United States alleged that a major beverage company misled consumers by implying its diet drinks aided weight loss, despite internal documents acknowledging the possibility of weight gain from increased appetite stimulation. The corporate reaction was defensive, but telling. Companies doubled down on marketing campaigns that framed artificial sweeteners as part of a balanced lifestyle. Influencers were paid to post content showing parents giving their children healthy, sugar-free snacks, subtly reframing criticism as fear-mongering. Behind the scenes, lobbying intensified. Lawmakers reported receiving more calls and visits from food industry representatives than ever before, warning of economic disaster if stricter regulations were passed. Meanwhile, the backlash was being fueled by another unexpected force: former industry insiders. A handful of chemists, marketing executives, and food scientists came forward to share what they had witnessed. They spoke of selective publishing, where only the most favorable research was greenlit for public release. They described internal debates about whether certain sweeteners could ever be considered truly safe for children, or pregnant women, debates that were silenced in the name of profit. The fight also reached the court of public opinion, where consumer trust is won or lost. In recent surveys, trust in diet and sugar-free labeling has dropped sharply, particularly among younger demographics who tend to research ingredients before buying. Social media has amplified the skepticism with hashtags like sweetener scam and fake health trending during high-profile controversies. The industry still commands vast power, but for the first time, its authority is being openly challenged on multiple fronts: in research labs, on supermarket shelves, in parliaments, and across TikTok feeds. The facade of safety is cracking, and through those cracks, more inconvenient truths are slipping into the light. The artificial sweetener industry was built on a promise of indulgence, without consequence, of modern chemistry rescuing us from the burdens of sugar's health risks. For decades, that promise went largely unchallenged. But as we've seen, the facade is cracking, and what's spilling out is a mixture of corporate greed, questionable science, and human cost. As the backlash intensifies, government scientists and everyday consumers are beginning to ask the same question: what now? In some countries, policymakers are pushing for a precautionary approach, limiting or banning certain sweeteners until independent long-term studies can prove their safety beyond doubt. This is a sharp contrast to the regulatory culture of the past, where products often remained on the market until overwhelming evidence forced a recall. The European Food Safety Authority has announced new evaluations for aspartame, citing both metabolic and neurological concerns. Meanwhile, health agencies in South America are openly warning citizens about potential risks, marking a significant break from decades of silent acceptance. The industry is scrambling to adapt. Some corporations are quietly shifting their product lines toward natural sweeteners, like stevia or monk fruit, hoping to ride the wave of consumer distrust towards something that sounds healthier. But even these alternatives aren't immune to criticism. Large-scale cultivation chemical extraction processes and aggressive marketing campaigns raise their own ethical and environmental questions. Technology is also entering the battlefield. Startups are working on next-generation sweeteners that claim to deliver sweetness without triggering the metabolic chaos of their predecessors. These biotech creations are designed to mimic sugar molecules so precisely that the body treats them more naturally. But if history has taught us anything, it's that even the most promising miracle ingredient can become tomorrow's scandal. For the consumer, the future is both empowering and daunting. Awareness is higher than ever. The same social media tools that corporations use to market their products are being weaponized against them, exposing shady studies, revealing lobbying efforts, and circulating investigative journalism to millions within hours. People are reading labels, researching ingredients, and sharing their findings with the kind of passion that used to be reserved for sports or politics. But awareness alone isn't enough. The truth is, there is no shortcut to a healthy diet, and as long as the food system is dominated by ultra-processed products, there will be a market for quick-fix ingredients, whether that's sugar, artificial sweeteners, or something entirely new. Without systemic change, the cycle risks repeating itself under a different name. The most chilling question remains if corporations were willing to downplay or conceal risks for decades. With the backing of powerful lobbyists, sponsored science, and slick marketing, how many other ingredients in our daily diet are being sold under the same carefully crafted illusions? In the end, the story of artificial sweeteners isn't just about diet sodas or sugar-free gum. It's a mirror held up to the entire modern food industry, an industry that thrives on half-truths, manipulates science to protect its profits, and is willing to gamble with public health as long as the numbers stay in the green. As consumers, we have more power than we're led to believe. Every purchase, every boycott, every social media post that spreads awareness is a strike against the complacency that allowed these chemicals to dominate our diets for so long. The reckoning isn't coming. It's already here. And the next chapter will be written not in corporate boardrooms, but in kitchens, classrooms, and communities across the world. Whether that chapter ends with real reform or yet another false promise, that's up to us.